Welcome back, everyone. Once again, I've got my Nording tobacco pipe. I'm an amateur tobacco pipe smoker. Usually takes me about 30 minutes just to get it to stay lit, but I'm learning. So if you have any tips, let me know. This podcast, I want to address the question of, are Catholics Christians? This is such a funny thing to hear as a Catholic, because you think, of course we are. But there's many Protestants, perhaps most, who don't think Catholics are Christians, especially Protestants who are fundamentalists or evangelicals. And I remember a time I was a Protestant going to a Southern Baptist church, and a good friend of mine, or a friend of mine, said, the Catholics? Well, they're not saved. And they're not saved means they're not Christians. No Catholics are saved, she thought. And I said, well, I'm not so sure about that, because I've got a good friend who's Catholic, and he seems to believe in Jesus and seeks to follow him and prays and reads the Bible and, believes in the Trinity. So even as a Protestant, I was not comfortable saying that Catholics were not Christians, because I knew some practicing Catholics. I also knew many Catholics who were not practicing, and that's what a lot of Protestants know as well. They know people who say they're Catholic, who grew up nominally Catholic or whatever, and their lives don't seem to be following Jesus at all. And there's also many Protestants who have former Catholics who left the Catholic Church and became Protestant. And they, typically the story is they didn't even know the gospel. They didn't know who Jesus was. They thought Mary was God also. They had this terrible formation and catechesis in their upbringing. And then naturally they leave the church because what they, thought the church taught was, pretty worthless. And they were presented the gospel as understood by a well-meaning Protestant, and they, by God's grace, became a Christian, or I should say, started trying to live their faith. Probably they were baptized already. So, are Catholics Christians? Well, really that question is one of authority. Who has the authority to say who are Christians? And all questions with regard to these issues that divide Protestants and Catholics goes back to authority. Because if we say, well, a Christian's a follower of Christ, well, Mormons say they follow Christ. But most Christians would say that Mormons are not Christians. The Catholic Church declared Mormons' baptisms to be invalid. So, how do you know? What's the criteria? Who gets to decide? And in Protestantism, the answer is, well, if you follow the Bible. And really what that means is if you follow the 66-book Bible interpreted in key doctrines as I understand it, or as I interpret it. So, that's what that means. And generally there are areas that Protestants would say are the non-negotiables, like the Trinity. You have to believe Jesus is God, He's one in being with the Father. All of these great Christological dogmas that the early church in the 4th and 5th centuries formulated. And we'll get back to that because that's an interesting point about those doctrines. They'll say if you believe in those, then you're Christian, and Mormons deny some of those, and so they're not Christians. Well, fair enough, but by what authority do they make that distinction? How do you know? And so a lot of Protestants will say, well, Catholics aren't Christians because they don't follow the Bible. They teach doctrines that are not found in the Bible, like the Assumption of Mary. Mary was brought into heaven at the moment of her death. There's an implicit idea there that, well, all revelation and divine truth must be found solely in the Bible. That's sola scriptura. Well, that's a whole other issue then that has to be demonstrated. And some Protestants would say to be a Christian you have to believe in sola scriptura. So, it goes on and on. But there's really other questions that are more fundamental. Well, how do you know what the scriptures are? How do you know that God inspired infallibly any writings? And if so, which ones are those? How do you know, even if He did that they're without error? How do you know that there's not any other revelation that's been given and preserved in the church, let's say through sacred tradition? So there's a lot of other questions that are more fundamental. But this is still one that gets asked a lot. So going back to the question of these great Christological and Trinitarian dogmas, well, the funny thing is, it was the early church in those first 400, 500 years that convened councils because those truths of the faith had not yet been crystallized, and they were being challenged by Arius, by Macedonius, by the Monophysites. And the church convened, the bishops, the priests, the theologians got together, led by the Pope, and then made a binding decree. This is true. Jesus and the Father, one in being. Jesus and the Holy Spirit, one in being. The Holy Spirit is God. Jesus is God. The Father is God. Jesus has two natures, the hypostatic union, all of these things. So, what was that church? What church holds ecumenical councils today? Well, the Catholic Church does. The Southern Baptist Convention doesn't hold those. They don't make any binding decrees on their member congregations. They say, well, here's a guideline, but each congregation can choose, what it wants to believe about women's ordination, let's say, and do its own thing. So, the early church is very Catholic. The doctrines they taught are very Catholic. When you read the church fathers, these early Christians, even those who are contemporaries with the apostles, like Clement and Ignatius of Antioch, they were teaching things that the Catholic Church teaches. A lot of things that the Protestant churches do not teach and would say is false. So, if you're a Protestant, you have to also be willing to say, if you say Catholics aren't Christians, a lot of those early church fathers, or even most of them, were not Christians because of what they believed. So that's problematic, because it means that already the faith had become corrupted, even shortly after the apostles. This is a common theme that I come back to, as you know. Anyways, thank you again for listening, and have a great day.